I'm glad everybody could join us this morning, either in person or remotely. So welcome. We're here for an interview seminar for our critical zone pedology position. Today our speaker is going to be Dr. Matthew Ricker. After the seminar, time is for other people to meet with Matthew if you aren't scheduled. We have an open faculty discussion period at 11 o'clock today in N224 Ag North. And then graduate students made a reservation for lunch tomorrow with Julie. That'll also be at noon in N224 Ag North. So many of the rest of us are scheduled to meet with Matthew other times during the day. So our speaker today is Dr. Matt Ricker. Matt's currently an assistant professor at Bloomsburg University of Pennsylvania, and he got his PhD degree in forestry from Auburn University. So he'll have a little bit more introduction about himself in his talk. So Matt, welcome.
Thank you. All right, yeah, so today I'm going to sort of talk about, since this is a critical zone pedology position, some of the work that I do with soils and pedology in crucial landscapes, mostly our riparian ecosystems or floodplains. This is what I've been doing for about 12 years. Been doing a little bit of geoarchaeology lately, but I don't have time to talk about that, so I'll sort of plug myself at the end of this shamelessly. Giving a talk at the Tri-Society meetings if you're interested in that type of stuff. So really what am I interested in these riparian areas? Interactions, soil, water, biology. And so this fits well with the critical zone concept. Just an overview of what I'm going to talk about, a little bit about my background. I have various degrees from various places, but it all makes sense when you take into account what I like to study, which is floodplains. And so I'll give a little introduction to myself, and then I'll talk about some of the sort of traditional biogeochemical functions and values that we have on floodplains and floodplain soils that are associated with those. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the research that I'm doing today, which is alluvial coal soils. So I'm working in a coal mining region in Pennsylvania, where we're looking at the impacts of coal mining on these particular soils and ecosystems. And I started some Maya geoarchaeology. I don't really have time to talk about it, but it's a pretty interesting application of pedology as well. And then sort of go over some future research directions and how I see this sort of fitting in here at University of Kentucky. I would like to mention I sort of specialize in research in floodplains, but I do a lot of work in uplands as well. And here's a nice spot of cell in northern Michigan. So I do a lot of teaching, a lot of non-research activities in uplands, but really what I do, a lot of my research and what I'm geared towards is these floodplain environments. So the critical zone concept, I'm pretty sure the critical zone concept says from the tops of the trees, but not everywhere is forested, right? So top of the vegetation, let's say, to the bottom of the groundwater. So this is our critical zone. It's a dynamic zone. You have to take into account soils here. It's an interaction between geology, water, and biology, which are 3 of our 5 soil-forming factors. We're leaving out topography and time. So to be a pedologist and to be a soil scientist, you have to basically work in the critical zone. You can't escape biology and water in this zone of geologic weathering. This zone is interesting to me because it's essential for sustaining life, and it's highly impacted by human alterations or anthropogenic alterations. This is an example of a human alteration to a soil. So this is actually in Guatemala. This is the Maya, the ancient Maya, sort of managing their soil resources. So this is a vertisol, a shrink swell soil underneath here, which is problematic for various reasons. So the Maya basically capped that with limestone, changing the chemistry. This has long-term effects. Obviously, the plants that are growing here now, there's species shifts associated with changes in the landscape or alterations, human alterations. And so we take into account here with the critical zone human alterations. And that's kind of where I fit in. So I like to study floodplains, and I have various degrees, geology, environmental sciences, and forestry, but pretty much everything I've done since graduate school has been soils related. I started off in geology in a small school called Mary Washington in Virginia. Got really interested in what they call fluvial geomorphology, which is the study of rivers and how rivers shape the landscape. and also took a soils class as a senior. And so that's what sort of got me interested in soils. Then I went to the University of Rhode Island, where I did mostly pedology work in riparian systems with Mark Stolt, and we basically looked at carbon biogeochemistry as well. So most of my master's is actually pedology. And then I went to Auburn University and got a PhD in forestry, where I focused more on biogeochemistry, nitrogen, phosphorus in these same ecosystems. But I also had a pedology component to that. So if you add up all the research that I did through my graduate career, 50% pedology, 50% biogeochemistry. And then I went a little crazy towards the biologic end. When I did a postdoc, I was actually growing Culex mosquitoes for a human health vector-borne disease project for the Georgia Department of Health. So I was studying water quality and human health, completely biotic. So my soil research career, I really came at it from an abiotic perspective. I couldn't identify a tree to save my life once I came out of undergrad. And by the time I went through my PhD, that's pretty much all I was doing. So I have varied degrees, but pretty much everything that I've done for the last 12 years is geared towards understanding soils in riparian systems. And they're complex systems. They're affected by human alterations on the landscape. And as we'll see, that shows up in these soils. So these soils are basically a record of environmental degradation or environmental change within watersheds. So currently I've sort of swung this back. So I went from abiotic to biotic, and now I'm back in the middle here. I'm going to talk about coal mining soils today, and some of the research that we're doing that's directly applicable to the state of Kentucky, which the state mineral is coal here. And then I'm going to plug myself at the end here for my new project that we're sort of working on in Guatemala. So basically, floodplain riparian soils, I'll give you a little rundown if you're not familiar exactly with how these form, why they're important on the landscape. This is what I like to study. So there's sinks for sediment and other nutrients. We've known this for quite a while. So these are the major, what we call now, ecosystem services provided by floodplains. So the floodplain is actually formed by the river processes. So every time that it rains and you have a flood, you carry sediment. And that sediment is deposited on the ground or the floodplain or the surface, and then you have a grading soil. So the soil is building up over time. It actually has a nice record of what's been going on within riparian zone or within the basin itself over long periods of time. We know that they're carbon sinks, and I'll talk a little bit about my carbon work that I've been doing as far as looking at atmospheric carbon lockup in these systems. And then they're also important for transformation of nutrients. So we call this water quality improvement. Here I am in a large floodplain, pretty excited about the rain, and there's water coming in, pouring into the soil, and we have all kinds of microbial and as well as vegetation transformations that can occur and take something harmful like nitrate, which would be a priority pollutant, right, in water, and removing that from the system. So our soils here act as sort of like a sponge or a scrubbing station for water quality. So I've studied these systems across the East Coast, first in New England, small systems, first, second order streams, headwater. And then for my PhD, I studied Congaree National Park in South Carolina, which is a large alluvial bottomland. And this is Congaree. It's a cypress-dominated alluvial bottomland that's about 4 miles across from the river. So you can be 4 miles from the river and be in the flood zone. So most interest in what I've been doing sort of in these riparian systems is my carbon research. I've done a number of things with nitrogen and phosphorus, but I would like to sort of talk a little bit about carbon and traditional biogeochemistry in these systems and what I've sort of found across varying landscapes on the East Coast. So some examples of sort of organic carbon pools, how much carbon is stored there within these systems and why they're important in the global carbon cycle. And what do we know at this point? There's a lot of things we don't know. This is an example. Has anyone heard the term legacy sediment? So it's more of an East Coast type thing. It's usually applied to the Piedmont in the Southeast, but this is legacy sediment. I'm going to mention this a bunch of times. Legacy sediment is sediment that was generated during early colonial periods in the East Coast. That sediment was generated without BMPs in the uplands, and then it filled our wetland or riparian systems with what we call legacy sediment. This is from cotton agriculture in Alabama. So you see the distinct change from a nice wetland soil down here with lots of carbon accumulation to this red soil. We have lasting impacts on the vegetation hydrology in these systems because of past legacies on the landscape. So again, we all like to think we're stewards of the land, but what does the land say about us? Sometimes it says some pretty interesting things. So a little bit about sort of pedology, right, including soil genesis. So the genesis of these soils, they're young soils, they're entosols or inceptosols, which are youngest soil orders. There's a combination of two main soil forming processes that are important here to take into account. We have humification, which is the production of carbon by plants through photosynthesis, falls onto the soil surface, and then is incorporated by micro and macroorganisms. So this is incorporation of organic matter into the mineral matrix. This is important to basically get this nice humus buildup within our soil. And then the big thing that separates floodplains from all other soils is alluviation. So alluviation is basically aggregation or a grading system where net sedimentation occurs. Every time it floods, this soil surface increases in height. And this is unique. You don't get this in uplands. In uplands, you're losing material down the landscape. So this is the depositional landscape where what's happening in the basin is actually showing up. So this is highly affected by land use change, and we get our legacy sediment again. From carbon-14 dates, we know that this surface at 50 centimeters in Rhode Island is about 1,700. So everything on top of that, that's the soil formation over about 20,000 years down there. This is about 200. So we've increased our rates of sedimentation greatly, and we can find this in the riparian zones. So we tend to bury our previously stable floodplain surfaces. This was the surface of the floodplain before European colonization. We call these buried A horizons or buried surfaces. They're very important, though, for long-term storage of carbon. So these are some of the most important aspects of this particular regional landscape, the riparian zone, is that it accumulates very high amounts of carbon. And so if you're looking for a place to store carbon or you want to do carbon accounting across the landscape, you want to understand how much carbon has been lost from land use change, perhaps in an upland like an agricultural area, you have to take into account how much carbon's been gained in the low landscapes. And this has been a problem for a number of years with global modeling of carbon dynamics, and the soil is one of the problems. It's very variable. So what have we found in sort of the research that I've done, both in New England and in South Carolina? Significantly higher soil organic carbon pools in these riparian zones compared to contiguous uplands. 2 to 5 times more carbon to a given depth in these systems. And the thing that we really want to take into account is what's the hydro period or what's the hydrology that goes on in these systems. And so we've known for a long time this traditional sort of process, as it gets wetter on the landscape, microbes aren't happy. So when the microbes aren't happy in the absence of oxygen, they can't break down organic matter, you build up carbon. This is important if you want to find areas with high carbon storage potential in the landscape. So this is within Congaree National Park in South Carolina. These are different mapping units or soil mapping units. Congaree and Taka are basically moderately well-drained or well-drained soils, about 100, 109 metric tons of carbon per hectare, about average within upland. As you move into the wetlands over here, which is our Chastain and Dorvan units, we get significant increases in the soil organic carbon that's stored to 1 meter here. So 193, almost 2 times more carbon in the Chastain, 533, 5 times more carbon in the Dorvan. The Dorvan's an organic soil, it's very wet. But the very interesting thing that we found in these systems is we take into account sort of the morphology of these buried surfaces. That's what's controlling carbon that's being deposited and stored for long periods of time here. And really, so if you look here, we have about 3 times more carbon in the Chastain that have these buried surfaces. And it's pretty interesting to note that I gave a talk at AGU last year, and I was suggesting we got to go over 3 meters in this. So future grad students are not going to be very excited about this, but if you want to know how much carbon's on the landscape, and we're doing soil sampling to 30 centimeters, we're missing, in this case, about 3 times more carbon at depth than within that 30 centimeter zone. And so in these systems, we got to go deep to figure out exactly how much carbon's on the landscape. So these deposits might be 200 years old, but they might be 3 meters deep. So my contribution to carbon sort of within these systems has been to quantify where it is, how high it is relative to uplands. We know it's higher relative to uplands. These are important areas in the landscape for storage of carbon. If you're worried about atmospheric CO2, that's an important process. Deeper is better for sampling. If you have longer hydro period, that's where most of the carbon is going to be. So sedimentation is positively correlated with carbon sequestration. So this is sort of what I thought I was going to be doing with the rest of my career: carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus dynamics within these systems. And then I moved to Pennsylvania, And things took almost a 90-degree turn almost immediately, because obviously I got there and I wanted to go down in the floodplain, start checking out what's going on. And in central Pennsylvania, the issue is coal mining, not sort of agricultural systems where you have excess nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus. So here's me in the field, pulling the core, having a great time. So we'll talk today a little bit about the impacts of coal mining on floodplains, which is an area in the literature that isn't really fleshed out at all. And actually, many people don't even know this process has occurred in the past. And it's pretty shocking to people when they first see it. And then I'm doing a project on Mara geoarchaeology that we just got funded, which I'll plug again. And then I've been working with the local USDA NRCS and soil quality health efforts. Don't really have time to talk about any of those, but these are the sort of the research avenues that I'm taking right now. So this is the North Branch Susquehanna River. This won, I think, River of the Year last year in Pennsylvania for its sort of beauty. It's a beautiful place to go kayaking, but this area was subject to extensive coal mining in the past. So we're in the Ridge and Valley province here in Pennsylvania, so we have structural control. So what that means is our geology is controlling the structure of the valley, and so therefore we have very narrow zone of flooding, so flood-prone areas. And so down here in this light area, this island as well, this is the riparian zone. And that's the area that I want to work in. That's the zone that is interacting with floodwaters. And I call this the ghost of coal mining past, legacy sediments in an industrial context. So I dug my first hole in Pennsylvania, and it became clear that the issues that I was thinking about, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, had to go out the window because I had meters and meters of coal that was unaccounted for on the landscape. So often we associate this legacy sediment concept with agriculture, and the problems associated with agricultural sediments that have washed down into these areas are nitrogen and phosphorus going into stream systems and causing eutrophication. Well, when you have coal, you have different issues. Heavy metals come to mind, and then acid sulfate conditions, which produce low pH. So when you see something like this, so this is modern alluvium up here, sort of brownish in color as you would expect. So this is the material that's being deposited by the river. And then down here, it's really, really, really dark. That's not organic. Well, it is organic matter, but it's 320 million years old. This is coal. These are stratified bands of coal. This is 40 miles from the nearest active mine. So it became abundantly clear. I went to the literature, and there was nothing on this process. So I wanted to get a handle on what was going on. So the general questions I've been asking are, how extensive are these deposits, and what's the long-term environmental consequences, especially when we're talking water biology. We're down next to a river system. The hydrology is interacting with this material all the time. Is there any risk of leaching materials out of here? And then what's this impact on the biology? So if you're going to grow a stand of forest timber, or you're going to try to grow corn or something in here, what is going to happen if you're actually not taking into account that you have all this coal? If you're familiar with coal here in Kentucky, this is a different type of coal. So the coal in eastern Pennsylvania is called anthracite coal. This is actually from Kentucky Coal Facts. I have a nice sort of diagram here. Basically, anthracite coal is the most pure type of coal. It's the rarest type of coal on Earth. These basins in pink here in Pennsylvania are about where I'm working. That's 95% of the mineable anthracite in the world. So anthracite is rare in that, so here's your bituminous coal, which you have in Kentucky. Very rare because it's in the Ridge and Valley, and it was compressed. It was compressed during basically the Allegheny orogeny, and that compression basically added pressure and heat and pushed out the impurities. This coal is 94% carbon. So by comparison, the coal in Kentucky is like 84% perhaps. So this is a very pure form of coal, almost metamorphic in type, and it has different properties, which makes it interesting for compare and contrast with the bituminous coal basins that are found more to the west. All right, so to understand how these soils form, these are anthropogenic sediments that are generated from coal mining. And it was coal mining that was without environmental or federal environmental regulations. So this is anthracite production in tons per year in eastern Pennsylvania. This is 1870 to 2010. And what you can see here is a sharp rise through the 1800s, peaked in 1917, over 100 million tons per year. Around that period, then steady declines to the Great Depression, a slight rebound, World War II. Knox mine disaster basically killed the anthracite region's economy. It was basically a large-scale industrial disaster, which exposed a lot of corruption within the industry itself, mob connections, etc. Kind of shut the whole thing down, and we've been really producing not much anthracite. We actually sell most of this anthracite to China today. But this red arrow here indicates the 1977 Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act. And as you can see, most anthracite was actually mined prior to this. So there were no environmental regulations. So what did you do? You dug the coal out. Unmarketable rocks were stacked up next to rivers called coal piles. Coal was washed mechanically in the breakers. For every ton of coal that was produced, 25 tons of water was used. That water was discharged directly back into the river systems, making an inky slurry. And that coal washed as far as the Maryland border, which is about 200 kilometers down the river. And we know this because Maryland and all those towns down there used to actually power their entire towns from the coal they dig out of the river. But that was a while ago, and we've kind of forgotten about this. So the first thing I wanted to do really is understand what the spatial extent of this problem was. So I looked in the literature, and like someone has to have studied this extensively, right? No. There's a few papers out there. There's actually arguments that we should use these deposits as key beds to sort of mark the Anthropocene, which is basically this time period in geologic time where humans have highly impacted the landscape, but really not much done on environmental consequences and spatial extent. So being a soil scientist, I wanted to figure out if we could come up with an idea of how extensive this process was. So we took a soil survey approach. So we don't know how much land is affected, but we know that pretty much any creek that was draining a coal basin, was the soils on the sides of that creek are formed from alluvium, which is material deposited by a river. So we used a soil survey approach. We went to the Susquehanna, Schuylkill, and Lehigh watersheds, which are the three largest watersheds that drain these anthracite basins. Any area draining coal, we selected the river systems coming out of there. We created buffers around those rivers, 50 meters. We're capturing basically the units, or the soil mapping units that are right next or contiguous to the streams. And then we had some criteria for pulling units. So anything formed from alluvium, which is a river deposit, anything mapped in a floodplain, and then anything with fluve as a formative element and indicates fluvial processes or river processes. So basically in this picture here, we are selecting what's in green. So we selected all areas draining coal that have these properties. And this is what we came up with. This is hot off the press, finished this 2 weeks ago. These are alluvial soil mapping units that potentially, and I have to put potentially because I haven't seen them all, but I could say confidently that there's coal in all these soils. And that's 26,000 hectares, 260 square kilometers, the size of Cincinnati, Ohio, of area affected by this process. I have two bars on here, a gray bar and a black bar. The black bar are soil mapping units that indicate that coal is there. So the soil mappers noted that there's coal. So we have river wash with coal in it. We have Lindside soil series with coal overwash, UD fluvens with coal overwash. And I circled Gibraltar. I'll talk a little bit about Gibraltar. That's the only soil type in Pennsylvania that is mapped that you recognize as a genesis of this was from coal mining and actually river processes. And why is this a problem? Because anything in gray here has no indication to a user of soil survey that there might be coal there, and associated interpretations. So I'm going to give you an example of what that means here with Middlebury. So Middlebury is a common soil series where I live in Columbia County, Pennsylvania, and we'll do the tale of two Middlebury units. So these units are 10 miles apart. They both form from rivers. This one on your left formed in Fishing Creek, which is an agricultural watershed that doesn't drain coal. This is what a Middlebury is supposed to look like. Middlebury is an inceptisol. It has this little BW horizon. It's weakly developed subsoil. It's very good for agriculture. It's got over 60% base saturation. So your idea is you want to plant some corn here, right? And you have good drainage. This 2C2, this is outwash. That's a glacial material that drains the water. So the water goes into this sort of loamy material up here, and it has good water holding capacity, and that drains out the bottom. It's a very good agricultural soil. So your idea is you want to grow corn. Well, if you open up a soil map or you use web soil survey today, you're going to see Middlebury mapped both in agricultural watersheds and along the Susquehanna River. Well, once you get down 30 centimeters, we have A, BW, it's pretty much similar. Now you get down to 40 centimeters and the story starts changing. I cut this off This goes to 3 meters. My students weren't very happy, but we kept going. This is CU. It's filled with glass. So this is filled with glass. This is just stratified coal. I have some close-ups of it. It's very impressive. It's just coal sands for 3 meters. It's about 9.5 feet. So obviously, interpretation, if you're growing corn, this has very low pH. You have problems with aluminum stress, right? Aluminum toxicity. What is happening with the microbes? What's happening with the plants here? What's happening with the water that's flowing through these two systems? Obviously, they're different. So what do I propose? Anything draining these coal basins has to have what we call a map unit phase coal overwash. It's going to have coal. I've looked at 25 sites that are mapped as alternate units. They all have coal. Everything has coal. Everything. It's pretty crazy. So again, we've sort of forgot history, I guess, or we don't want to think about it. So Gibraltar Soil Series is the only soil series in Pennsylvania that's mapped that is exclusively generated from this process. So if you map Gibraltar, you've recognized that this process has occurred. And the reason Gibraltar is mapped and not like Middlebury, if you notice there's a cap of like 1.5 feet of brown stuff on top of that Middlebury, it's hard to see. Just sort of looking at the soil on the surface, you can't tell there's coal there. It's buried. In certain watersheds like the Lehigh and Schuylkill, that coal is still on the surface. So if you plow that, you can see it. So literally, it's much easier to map Gibraltar series because it's on the surface. It's only found in 2 watersheds, Schuylkill and Lehigh in eastern Pennsylvania, approximately 2,062 hectares, but this would have been much greater prior to the 1940s. The Schuylkill River desilting project occurred. This is some pictures or photo plates from 1951, publication on that. On what they did, they basically removed all the coal. This is probably 2-3 meters of coal associated with this island. The island actually just formed from industrial waste. So basically, the water slowed behind these columns and filled in, made an island, and some trees grew on it. So now we're restoring that. We dug all the coal up, and there's our restored island. I'd like to probably see some vegetation on there, but it was the 1940s. So we would have had way more areas mapped as Gibraltar. It's not a very extensive series, but a lot of those areas were removed in the past. Side note, this material was shipped to Philadelphia and used as the base for the Philadelphia International Airport. So why is this important? It's a transboundary issue. There's nothing that land managers hate more than being alerted to a problem that they thought wouldn't exist where they live. So here's a picture. This is the Schuylkill River. This is Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Up here to the north of the coal basins in black. This is where active coal mining is occurring even today. If you've ever drank Yingling, it comes from here, Pottsville, Pennsylvania, which is a coal town. So these are the coal basins. So I ran a field tour this summer, and I showed some of these soils off down here near Pottstown. This is about 100 river kilometers from the active basins. And what we did is dug one of these Gibraltars out, and boom, there it is. Pretty neat. So you can see why you can tell this one's on the landscape. These actually have been plowed. There's an AP here. This gobbledygook up here is the actual series, coarse loamy mixed active non-acid mesic molic udifluvents. The ent is the important part. It's an entisol. It's a very young soil, but the molic is telling him that it's black. Almost looks like a mollisol, right? So if you're plowing this up, you think this is the greatest soil you've ever found. We're going to plant some corn in there. Probably not the best idea. This stuff has very, very low pH, aluminum problems for sure for plant growth. So this is Gibraltar. This is a meter, 1.2 meters. And you can imagine all the graduate students from the Northeast in soils and all the professors, the time we had in this one. Lots of issues with these soils. I would like to point out Kentucky has the exact same soil map here. It's called NELS. It's a coarse loamy mixed active non-acid mesic molic udifluvent. NELS is exactly the same. The only difference is it's bituminous coal, non-anthracite. And it's actually mapped in 3 times more area. Much more extensive. It's mapped mostly in the Big Sandy watershed, which is in eastern Kentucky. It is in West Virginia as well, and in the Ohio River. So this process has occurred here too, and the soil maps sort of point that out. So the big thing, what am I doing? There's little or no study of environmental interpretations, which is kind of pretty crazy. We know these deposits are there, right? But what is the long-term consequence to water and biology? I don't have all the answers. I'm just a lowly soils person that's sort of found this process, but every time I get talks on this, people get interested and come up to me and see if we can get some collaborations going. So it's a really shocking thing when you show people this process. So what we've been doing is our first cut is really looking at 10 sites, alluvial landscapes that are formed by rivers. And we're looking at the Susquehanna River for convenience because it's near where I live. We're looking at river islands, which are in the middle of the river, and then deltas or tributary deltas, which is like this. So this is Nescafet Creek. The creek is entering the main stem of the Susquehanna here, and it's dropped basically all the sediment that makes a delta shape. So what we've been doing is taking cores greater than 1 meter. I think I have 24 done now. All of them go to 1.2 meters, some to 1.5. It just depends on how deep it is and how much your back can hold out. Plus 10 grab samples on the surface, and these are why we're taking the grab samples, because we want to know the spatial distribution of properties right across the surface, which is pretty much what we're interacting with as people and plants and water, etc. So we looked at coal contamination using light microscope and trace metals using X-ray fluorescence and ICP analysis. We have a really good, nice spatial distribution of sites. So in green are our islands, and red are our tributary deltas. This is the northern. If you're familiar with Pennsylvania, or you watch the show The Office, Scranton is right up here. So Scranton, Wilkes-Barre are coal towns. So as you can see, this entire main stem, North Branch, Susquehanna, is draining a large northern basin here. These are the middle and southern basins. The Schuylkill is down here below the view here, and over near Hazleton, this is the Lehigh River. So these are the 3 rivers that drain these areas. So we're looking on the Susquehanna. Here's our nice spatial distribution of sites. And what have we found so far? Everything has coal in it to some degree, everything. Surface has coal all the way down to basically the Pleistocene contact when the glacier was there 20,000 years ago. Literally, the floodplain is completely generated by coal processes. Found at all depths, all textures, all landscapes. That's what this textural triangle is showing you. So we have high, medium, and low coal concentrations in these soil samples. And as you can see, the distribution does not change depending on texture. It does not change depending on the energy of the flood, right? So sandy loam is a sandier material. You need more energy to move sand. These are high energy deposition here in sandy loam. Silt loam is low energy deposition. No matter where you are on the floodplain, you have coal in the Susquehanna. And so we're having to actually come up with categories and things to describe this. Low, medium, high, we're talking 10% or less, low, medium, 10 to 25. Once you get over 25% coal in the matrix, that's a dominant feature. You can just easily see it. The silts start coating all the other grains. I don't know, I just remember the first time I pulled one of these cores out and it was, ooh, my mind. Trace metals and sulfur are problems associated with coal mining, as we know from the literature and coal soils, which are usually at the mine site itself. We have elevated trace metals in these soils as well, and we also have sulfur problems, or problems with generating acid sulfate conditions. So trace metals are concerned, and what did we find when we're looking at the metals in the soils? The metals are most correlated with the percentage of coal that's actually in that horizon. The more coal you have in that soil, the more trace metals you're having. Typically 4 to 10% or 4 to 10 times background levels. So every time we'd show, so initially we're doing stuff like this, sort of these correlations, and then I go to meetings and be like, well, how do you know that it's anthropogenic? How do you know it's enriched? So I went back and we calculated enrichment factors relative to a background. Everything is enriched, arsenic, lead, chromium, copper. Enrichment is most evident in chromium, copper, and lead. So these are the regional background levels, these dashed lines here. As you can see, even in islands and deltas, regardless of where you are, you have elevated levels of, say, on the bottom here, lead, and that is highly correlated to the amount of coal that's in those soils. Good news, nothing we found is even close to the EPA limits for soils. However, this is just total lead, total chromium, total copper. We're not doing speciation, so I don't know. There could be other more potentially harmful types or species or forms of these metals in there that we don't know about. So when we're sampling these, we're wearing gloves, all kinds of stuff, because you never know what's in there. We also have PCBs, mercury, that I'm not looking at. So the good thing, metals are below EPA limits. We don't know what the impacts are to plants and fauna, though. So obviously, if you're a little toad and you're breeding in a pool that is formed in a soil that has lots of lead, there may be problems there, impacts to wildlife, flora and fauna. And then our fluxes in water, we are pretty sure that a lot of this isn't coming out because you'd see it in the river system itself. So it's locked in there, but we don't know much about the actual soil water, what's going on in these systems. Something to think about. Sulfur is another issue. Just like with the metals, we see elevated sulfur. And again, that is correlated very highly with coal percentage in the soil. And then if you look at soil pH or ambient soil pH with sulfur, if you have very high sulfur, this is 1% sulfur, by the way, 10,000 parts per million, very high sulfur. You're talking low pHs. So our pHs are very low. We're probably having problems for plant growth. It's probably slowing plant growth because of aluminum problems, aluminum toxicity, basically. So there's significant relationships between coal, sulfur, and pH, but we haven't seen any materials yet that are particularly worrisome from a standpoint of leaching out metals, or that the pH goes so low below 4, which we call a sulfidic horizon, that we're going to get huge, large-scale environmental impacts. So there are some interesting data here. So we're doing these incubation pH experiments where you basically incubate the soil for 16 weeks, and any sulfides or reduced forms of sulfur and oxidize through this process. And what you tend to see if you have oxidizable sulfur is a lowering of pH over time. And we get this in pretty much all of our soil samples, but only 4%, which is this one in red here, the G1, 20 to 40 centimeters, has actually classified out as sulfidic with a drop of pH over 16 weeks below 4. So when you add that up over 260 square kilometers, 4%, we still might have some issues here. Again, these are some issues that we're thinking about. So these are some ideas or things that I'm seeing. What do I want to do with this? Obviously, we have lots of areas that are impacted in Appalachians by coal mining, even today. I think it'd be an interesting compare and contrast the bituminous coal fields, which are found in southern Appalachians, or even western Pennsylvania. It's much more numerous coal as well. So this process with anthracite might not, what we're finding with anthracite might not basically transfer over seamlessly to bituminous. We might have to do similar analyses, but it would be a good compare and contrast which type of coal, what type of effects it has on these systems and soils. I have some sort of collaborators in place. Elaine Plant at University of Pennsylvania and I are doing some leaching experiments and looking at partitioning coal out from soil organic matter, sort of look at that using thermal methods, TGA, DSC. And then I'm working with Amber Pitt and Ben Odiambo. One is a biologist, the other is a geologist, to basically look at effects on plants and amphibians. In these systems, we're targeting USGS, NSF, and EPA funding on these things. And something I would like to mention is I would like to get back to my roots. So I currently don't have a lab setup where I can do nutrients. And so I do like doing nutrient work, which is more applicable to agricultural lands, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus. Western Kentucky, good spot for this. There's actually some very interesting bottomland areas, Clark's River and Ohio River Islands, national wildlife refuges that would probably provide a lot of ecosystem services in agricultural areas. And the big thing that excites me about this position is there's a lot of in-house collaborative opportunities. So I'm at a teaching school right now, which doesn't really do a lot of research, and finding collaborators locally is problematic. So UK has lots of potential for collaboration in plant and soils, forestry, biosystem engineering, natural resource, environmental science, and others. So that's part of this that is was exciting about this position to me. I would like to point out, I would like to look at how effective are environmental regulations, right? So here's our old, right? So this is the top, older materials at the bottom. This is our packages of high coal. What we tend to see is the alluvium has less and less coal over time. And so in this system, this is correlating both with the collapse of the coal industry, but also environmental regulations. This offers a unique opportunity to actually look at the effects of environmental regulations. About done, shameless plug time for myself. Here's me in a hole in downtown El Peru, Waka. It's an abandoned Maya city. It was a classic Maya city. It's in northern Guatemala, northwest Guatemala, occupied 500 BC to 800 AD. And we're doing some soil work. I met an archaeologist that was interested in sort of what I do with pedological research. And could that be useful to look at reservoirs or surface water management features in an archaeological context? And being untenured and pretty young and crazy, I said, sure, why not? So I've been in Guatemala the last 2 summers. We do 30-day field tours down there, no breaks, literally like 12 hours a day, and it's 100 degrees. So they're pretty intensive field excursion. This is an archaeology project, but I'm doing all soil research in the swamps and bajos. So our major question, how did the Maya manage surface water systems? And this is a pretty cool project because the Maya had lots of problems. They had wet, dry season hydrology. They call this the green desert. For 3 months out of the year, they don't get any rain. So how did they keep water through that dry season? And then 7 months out of the year, it rains too much. So how did they deal with that in an urban core? Soils are important for this because we can look at soluble salts, things like gypsum coming out in the soils to say there's a water quality impairment here. And then we also have some cool soils, vertisols, the shrink swell soils, and it's a karst landscape. So holding water up in a karst landscape is difficult. So we're on karst right now, I'm assuming, since it's limestone, right? So we have disappearing streams. That's a logistical nightmare. So we're using soils to figure out how the Maya manage these things. And we just got a National Geographic proposal 2 weeks ago, funded, to do this in 2018. So this is where I work. Well, that picture was taken right there. I was right in downtown. This is a 3D rendering of the site. And actually, these aren't mountains, these are pyramids. It's all covered in jungle now, but it's a pretty interesting site and a pretty interesting application of pedology to these problems. So I'm giving a talk at the Tri-Society meeting in Tampa on this. I don't have all the data crunched yet, but if you're interested in that, talk to me while I'm here. And then Monday, October 23rd, I'm giving a talk and a poster about it. I'm sure you probably have some questions. I'll try to provide some answers, see how it goes. Like these students, what is the soil? So anyway, thanks for your attention. And that's all I got for now. Plenty of time for questions.
Hey, plenty of time for questions.
I'm curious, in these high cold soils, alluvial cold soils, how that impacts particle size distribution and texture. I mean, does it really impact those?
So it's great. So we're actually having to remake or sort of retool our just basic laboratory analyses. So it's almost impossible with just a basic muffle furnace to separate organic carbon from the coal because some of it's volatilizing. So that's why we're using advanced analyses on that. The particle density of the anthracite's hard coal is like 1.9 grams per centimeter cubed, whereas it's a mixed lithology, so everything else is like 2.6. So if you're using like a settling, like a hydrometer or something like that, it elevates the clay content, but we're not sure how much because each sample has a different proportion of carbon or of coal in it. So basically, we've just been running analyses as is. I'm writing sort of this overview paper I was asked to write as part of that field tour about the problems with these soils for traditional analyses. Just in the lab, they're very difficult to work with. Everything we have set up is for minerals, regular minerals. These are coal minerals, and they kind of overlap the organic matter. It causes all kinds of issues. So yes, we are aware that the clay is elevated in a lot of those measurements, but we don't have anything situated where we can look at that. We're going to try to start using like laser particle analyzers, see if we can get better resolution and compare the two, but yeah, they're difficult. They just make you pull your hair out. So you can't just do anything. It's just like, oh, I want to do an analysis. Oh, well, okay, got to think about it. So yeah, so I'm sort of, we have lots of arguments in the field about it, so we're compiling all those issues currently.
I just wonder, do they hold more water than you would expect, or are they more permeable?
It depends on the distribution of the coal particles. So the coal sands, we know transmit water pretty well. but then they tend to, like the coal silts tend to swell up when you wet them. And so I'm not really sure. So we're thinking about doing some leaching experiments, putting in some piezometers and lysimeters and stuff like that to sort of try to start seeing what's going on as far as water movement for these materials. We don't know if it slows groundwater movement or speeds it up, or because there's all these void spaces in there too. It tends to, the coal tends to hold a lot of water even when you dry it at like 110 Celsius. So it takes longer to remove that water.
Yeah, so a couple of the major concerns with coal are selenium and pHs. I didn't see you show anything about that. Did you analyze for those?
Yeah, I don't have the analytical capabilities for selenium, so
Okay.
we haven't.
And then the other thing was, is anything showing up in the groundwater?
Yeah, so they don't really monitor groundwater. A lot of this area doesn't have really good groundwater aquifers. So we're in basically, we don't have a lot of sandstones. It's mostly impermeable fractured shales. So yeah, as far as I know EPA monitors around there because there's a number of brownfield Superfund sites that are actually, and that's the other thing, it's next to a river. So I always get the question, well, is that chromium coming from other industrial processes, right? But it's difficult to sort of say. But yeah, as far as I know, there's, besides the brownfield sites, there's no monitoring of groundwater going on. So surface water, we don't see anything leaching out of these systems. We're at a level that's indicating human health impacts. So that's, the pH is buffered enough, especially on the surface, that a lot of these metals are probably not available in biology, which is good to know. Yep.
So you are in a primarily undergraduate institution. Can you talk a little bit about teaching, how you engage your students?
Yeah.
Are these students?
Oh yeah, so that's a field class I taught in northern Michigan. So yeah, I've done a lot of teaching. So in the last 3.5 years, I've taught 19 classes and 14 labs. Teach a lot. So I also do soil judging. And easiest way to engage students is to go outdoors and do hands-on things. Luckily, I teach soils, so that's pretty much all we do. I teach soils from a practical standpoint. I give students exercises that are directly applicable to jobs. So I'm hired more of in an environmental context. So most of our students go to the environmental consulting field. So I teach things like wetland delineation, septic systems, physical properties of the soil for construction, things of that nature. Chemical properties, obviously, for remediation. I teach bioremediation as well, a little bit, like a super in-depth level. But yeah, so teach a lot of students, a lot of field work, a lot of field trips. We go to New Jersey every other semester to show coastal wetlands and stuff like that. So yeah. I have a lot of teaching experience.
So you basically we're showing that 80 years of mining affected a meter of soil.
Yeah, give or take.
So are there, that seems quite fast. Are there other examples of different processes that have that rapid effect over that depth in soil formation?
So the idea of legacy sediment is the same process that was usually intensive agriculture, mostly cotton and tobacco on the Piedmont physiographic province of the East Coast. And because those soils at the time had basically leached all the clay in the subsoil, we call it renic or grosserenic morphology. So the top was sandy, basically, and then over top of like 40% red clays. Basically, they tilled that all up without going on contour, without best management practices, and it all went down the hill. And so now, if you ever go to like Georgia, you notice all the loblolly pines. The reason being you can't grow intensive agricultural crops in the Piedmont physiographic province because the entire topsoil, which I think they estimated to be 18 inches across the entire Piedmont, which extends from Alabama all the way up to like parts of Pennsylvania. So 18 inches of topsoil. But then that washes down into these small linear areas, right? So it doesn't take much to stack up since you are diffusely eroding over large spatial areas and funneling that down into a small, basically corridor, it doesn't take much to stack up a lot of material. So there is lots more study on legacy sediment from agricultural productivity that shows in Rhode Island we found 80 centimeters on average legacy sediment. In Congaree National Park, I've seen 7 feet, and that's just from cotton agriculture. So yeah, it's basically, if you don't have best management practices, you mobilize sediment and it gets entrained and it's stuck in the system. And so we have an imbalance, actually, a sediment imbalance. That's why if you go to the beach, go to the ocean beach, they're always spending tons of money to dredge up sand and put it back. It's because we have reservoirs and stuff trapping all that. So basically that process is called stream disequilibrium. Too much sediment in certain areas, not enough in other areas. It's basically a global process. And this is why this particular process was brought forward as a way of quantifying human impacts on the landscape for the Anthropocene geologic time period, which is basically the time period where humans have affected the geological cycle to the point where we can see. One of the few papers was Stinchcomb et al. 2013 on these soils was specifically for that reason.
So at one point you talked about coal going all the way down to sort of the glacial outwash.
Yep.
So that was a natural process, and then you sped it up?
Yeah, so sedimentation occurs.
No, I mean the coal, like the.
Oh, there's barely any coal in the outwash. It's very evident. So yeah, I mean, I showed a picture of outwash there. There's barely, so the glacier, I probably have to just show you the map, but I think I have one on here.
Or actually, no, it's not the glacial outwash, but you said something about the Pleistocene.
Yeah, so that's
Sediments, there was coal already.
well, there's coal to the top of it.
Yeah.
So it's basically anthropogenic sediments over glacial.
Okay.
So we changed the hydrology. It probably blew out whatever sediment was there originally, washed it out, and then replaced it with 200-year-old sediment. So pretty much, yeah, we have Susquehanna has 3 meters of material. It's all 200 years old. Pretty, you can find bricks and glass and parts of old shoes and whatever right at that contact. Pretty amazing.
Have you noticed anything unusual about the biology, so the tree species that are present, or mycelia, or anything?
Yeah, so one of our ideas is invasive species propagation. So a lot of invasive species in these areas, especially Japanese knotweed. And the other invasives that we see a lot of is the, think about it, Asiatic crazy snakeworm. It's a worm species that basically is wreaking havoc in lots of areas in the Northeast, but both those species tolerate high metals and low pH, and they both do extremely well only in these corridors, these riparian corridors. So it's, every time I dig in this material, I have pictures of those crazy snakeworms that are like literally green, and they're just living in the coal. So they, you know, thinking about bioaccumulation, if you are basically feeding and constantly living in there, and you get eaten by a bird. So we're thinking about sort of food chain propagation of metals. So they're small, probably not from a human standpoint impactful, but for sort of amphibians that breed in these areas, soil biology, etc. Done nothing with microbes. So a number of folks from Maryland were very interested in the microbial impacts of all this going on. So we have some analogs that we can look at in coal soils, but they're typically at mine reclamation sites. And like I mentioned, the mine reclamation site is totally different. So they used to use this analogy in Pennsylvania. They call them bony piles. So like a slaughterhouse analogy, you're basically killing the mountain, and the bones you stack up on site, and the blood wash down the drain. So I'm looking at the blood, right, that's washed down the river, and most of the coal soil literature we're actually not finding in our lab methods is not gelling. But we have all the fines that washed out, which would be analogous to coal slurry, right? So coal slurry is different than stacks of rocks at the site, right? And so everything that we're looking at is we're having to make up. We're looking for clues in the literature, but the literature is not done here, so it's a completely different set of rules. So you get these really stony, rocky soils at the site, and then here, these are all silts and sands and washerwood. I don't know what that means, but it's different. And the ecology is pretty much silver maple, river birch, American sycamore, pretty standard floodplain